Imagine an era without electric light, where the boundary between myth and reality was as thin as a breath. In the heart of the Middle Ages, a new civilization was forged from the ashes, on the very continent of a volatile Europe. It was a vast tapestry woven from contrasting threads, the pride of the nobility and the authority of kings, faith burning amidst bloody wars, the sublimation of culture alongside daring commercial inventions. All these elements together laid the first bricks for the modern world in which we live. This is the epic of how Europe was born. Part 1. The legacy of the empire and the dawn in the storm. Travel back in time to the first 2 centuries AD. At that time, the Roman Empire spanned the Mediterranean like a serene giant. It was the era of Pax Romana, a Roman peace guaranteed by iron, blood and law, bringing unprecedented prosperity. The people of that time enjoyed a brilliant culture, a quality of life far exceeding all contemporary standards, and absolute safety under the shadow of invincible legions. All of this was possible thanks to a sophisticated centralized government apparatus and an astonishingly advanced infrastructure system. But in the distant eastern frontier, a new seed had sprouted: Christianity. Initially, it was just a troubled small branch of Judaism, but like an underground current, this religion silently spread, weaving through every corner of the pagan Roman world. Moving into the 4th century, a historical turning point occurred. Christianity was accepted by the emperors and officially became the state religion of Rome. Yet, ironically, just as faith ascended the throne, the golden age of the empire also began to close. The monster of inflation, horrific epidemics, persistent famine, and waves of invasion from the borders exhausted Rome. Managing a vast territory from a single centre now became an impossible mission. In 395, a fateful stroke divided the empire in two. The western part kept Rome as its heart, while the eastern part chose Constantinople as its lighthouse, later known to us as the Byzantine Empire. The divergence was harsh. While the East maintained wealth, urbanization and prosperity, the West fell into poverty, ruralization and weakness. A body divided, and the weaker parts certainly could not survive for long. From the deep old forests beyond the borders, barbarians began to stir. They were mostly Germanic tribes, courageous warriors led by steel generals and absolutely loyal bands of troops. These waves of people exerted increasingly suffocating pressure on the Rhine and Danube rivers. In its death throes, the Western Roman Empire had no choice but to open its doors, allowing them to pour into its territory. Finally, the border dams completely shattered. It facilitated a massive migration, where many different peoples flooded in to settle right in the heart of the empire. Whether they came as guests or invaders, these peoples tore the Roman territory into fragments of power, while the Western Roman court collapsed painfully day by day. In 476, destiny completed a ruthless cycle. The leader Odoacer deposed the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus. It was a mocking irony that the last king bore the name of the great founder of Rome. That young emperor was actually just a powerless puppet, but his overthrow marked an epical milestone. The Western Roman Empire officially disintegrated. A new chapter opened on the continent, the period we call the Early Middle Ages. Although posterity later labelled this the Dark Ages, in reality, it was not a funeral for civilization, but the moment when a new operating system for Europe began to be forged from chaos. Part 2. The blending and the kingdoms on the mud. From the ruins, a new structure formed. The old Romans, the Christian faith and the strength of the barbarians, these three core elements collided, moulded and blended to create the identity of medieval Europe. Around the year 500, all of Europe was a mosaic of new kingdoms belonging to barbarian kings. Their aristocracy, a hybrid of Roman and Germanic blood, gradually bowed before the cross, converting to Christianity. Prominent names began to be etched into history: the proud Ostrogoth kingdom in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, and the powerful Franks in the region of Gaul, the foundation of future France. However, these kingdoms were like castles built on sand. They lacked the key mechanisms to operate a state. The brilliant cities of antiquity were now just desolate ghosts, their populations scattering to the countryside to find a way to survive. The great Roman transportation system was abandoned, causing long-distance trade to fall silent. Gold coins no longer circulated, leading to the collapse of the monetary economy, and professional armies disintegrated accordingly. Knowledge was stifled as literacy levels declined seriously, leaving the administrative apparatus almost paralysed. Worst of all, safety had vanished. Western Europe became poor, closed off, and fragmented both politically and linguistically. In those first volatile centuries, Western Europe appeared as a sickly child, trembling next to its giant and powerful neighbours. Look to the east. While Western Rome was only deserted streets where weeds grew over ruined monuments, in Constantinople gold and splendour still shone, and in Baghdad the House of Wisdom was lighting up all of humanity. The West at this time was completely eclipsed, pushed to the fringes of civilization, remaining only a land of mud, blood, and prayers in despair. Moving into the 6th century, a glimmer of hope, or rather, a burning ambition, appeared from the east. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, along with his powerful and sharp wife Empress Theodora, endeavoured to realise a crazy dream, reconquering the West to revive the old Roman glory. He wanted to sew up the tear of the empire with the sword of the talented general Belisarius. But the price of glory was the blood of millions and an exhausted treasury. But destiny seemed to have turned its back on Rome. After long and brutal wars to retake Italy from the Romanized Ostrogoths, this peninsula was no longer a paradise but only a massive graveyard. And then, as the Byzantine army had just withdrawn or was exhausted, Italy again became tasty prey for new, more aggressive and rugged invaders, the Lombards. The dream of unification once again vanished like smoke, leaving a peninsula fragmented for the next millennium. The Byzantines finally had to taste the bitterness of helplessness. They were forced to accept a painful reality like an open wound. The dream of a unified Roman Empire connecting the East and West had forever shattered along with the piles of rubble in Italy. Justinian's efforts were now just a luxury nostalgia, but destiny did not give them time to mourn the past. Just as Constantinople's gaze left Rome, they soon had to face another division, even more fierce and vital. It was no longer a dispute between brothers of the same faith, but a life and death line between the aging Christian North and a fresh, vital South, rising strongly like an unstoppable tide. In the 7th century, while both great empires, the Byzantine and the Persian, were still exhausted after protracted wars, from the burning sands of the Arabian desert, a new power exploded. With the sword of the burning Islamic faith and a desire to change the world, Arab armies swept through the Middle East and North Africa at lightning speed, a conquest so fast it alarmed every throne of that time. In just a few decades, they created a massive Islamic empire stretching from the borders of India to the Strait of Gibraltar. The once homogeneous Mediterranean world was now torn into 3 distinct civilizations: Islamic, Byzantine, and Western. Although they frequently clashed on the battlefield, there still existed incredible underground flows of trade and thought between them. While the West was preoccupied with power struggles, in brilliant centres like Cordoba or Baghdad, Muslim scholars diligently preserved and translated ancient Greek manuscripts of Aristotle or Plato. These were the invaluable treasures of knowledge that Europeans would later have to borrow back to serve as the foundation for the explosion of the Renaissance. However, in the West at that time, admiration for knowledge was overshadowed by military fear. In the 8th century, they felt like a weak fortress being swallowed by the rising Islamic wave from the south. Islamic forces had wiped out the Visigoth kingdom in Spain and continued their rapid advance into the territory of Francia, threatening the heart of continental Europe. Nevertheless, at the Battle of Tours in 732, a symbolic turning point occurred. Under the command of Charles Martel, nicknamed the Hammer, the Franks stopped the advance of the Islamic army. Although modern historians argue that this was actually an expeditionary force for looting rather than a full-scale invasion, this victory has been etched in history as a steel shield protecting the West. It was not just a battle, but a massive political legend that helped the Martel family affirm their position as the saviour of the faith. Islamic expansion was halted. Charles Martel not only saved the West, but also left his name to a dynasty that would change the map of Europe forever, the Carolingian dynasty. Part 3, the Carolingian dynasty and the dream of empire. Martel's son, Pepin the Short, a name that sounds humble but carried within it a massive ambition. He understood that swords could seize land, but only sacred recognition could hold a throne. Pepin carried out a bloodless coup, overthrowing the last lazy kings of the Merovingian line to officially step onto the throne of the Franks. But most important of all was a masterstroke of political manoeuvring. He marched down to Italy, crushed the Lombards who were threatening the city of Rome, and gifted the Pope the territories of central Italy. This action was not just a gift. It laid the first bricks for the secular power of the Church, a new political entity where religion and kingship were tied together like a shadow to its form. But history only truly shuddered when its greatest character appeared, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who succeeded in 768. Imagine a man of giant stature in both the literal and figurative sense. He did not sit still on the throne to enjoy pleasure. Charlemagne spent nearly half a century, decades on horseback, directly commanding more than 50 campaigns across the continent. From the old forests of Saxony to the snowy mountains of the Pyrenees, wherever his horse's hoofprints went, the boundaries of the Franks expanded there. He was not just a warrior, he was the one who gathered the fragments of Western Europe to create for the first time a unified entity under the rule of a father of the entire continent. On the fateful Christmas Eve of 800, amidst the hazy space filled with incense of St. Peter's Basilica, history witnessed a moment that shook the world. As Charlemagne was kneeling in prayer, Pope Leo III suddenly placed the golden crown on his head and hailed, "Emperor of the Romans." After more than 3 long centuries submerged in darkness since the day Rome fell, the title of Emperor once again echoed in the West. This was not just a ritual, it was a declaration that the West had been revived. A new Christian empire had been born from the ashes of the past. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne's iron hand rose to become the first superpower of the Middle Ages. It was not just a vast territory, but a political entity carrying the DNA of modern Europe. Look at the map today. The borders between France and Germany, or the structure of Western European nations, all bear the shadows from the decrees that Charlemagne signed. He created an order where personal loyalty was elevated into a governance system, leaving a deep legacy that the flow of history thousands of years later still cannot erase. Charlemagne understood that a sustainable empire could not be built only with swords, but also with knowledge. Although he himself struggled his whole life with learning to write, he was the greatest patron of culture. The Carolingian Renaissance exploded, turning monasteries into the only lighthouses in the dark night. Here, monks diligently hand-copied thousands of manuscripts, restoring cultural quintessence, the Latin language, and the Greco-Roman knowledge that had been forgotten. It is thanks to these pages of manuscripts in the easy-to-read Carolingian minuscule script that humanity's heritage of knowledge escaped being buried in the dust of ignorance. This empire sowed onto European soil the seeds of a completely new social model. Titles like Duke and Count began to be standardized, and a hierarchy system was formed. But most important was the ideal of Christendom, a unified Christian West. There, regardless of whether you were a Frank, a Saxon, or a Lombard, you belonged to a common community under a sacred kingship and a single faith. That was the dream of harmony that Europe would continue to pursue for many centuries thereafter. However, history is always harsh. That glamour and unity soon revealed fatal cracks as soon as Charlemagne breathed his last. The Carolingian Empire was too vast, too diverse in ethnicity and language to be held firm by weaker hands. Jealousies, personal ambitions, and the lack of a consistent administrative system began to erode the foundation of this great empire. Every effort at centralization by successors fell into a stalemate due to a severe lack of material foundations. In a world where the commercial economy was still too weak and cities were small and isolated, maintaining a remote management apparatus was unthinkable. The old Roman roads were now damaged and covered in mud, making communication and the transport of orders so slow as to be obsolete. When a king in Aachen issued a decree, it might take months for it to reach the distant border. By then, it was often too late. In 843, a sad chapter opened. Charlemagne's grandsons, instead of protecting their grandfather's legacy, plunged into bloody fratricidal wars. At Verdun, they signed a treaty officially dividing the great empire into 3 parts, a fatal blow to the dream of unity. This treaty did not just divide land, it split the heart of Europe, creating the seeds of territorial conflict that would last for centuries between later nations. The Middle Peace quickly declined and was torn apart, leaving only 2 main entities surviving: West Francia, the land that would forge the identity of a brilliant France, and East Francia, the hardy land that would later develop into a powerful Germany. This division reshaped the geopolitical map of the continent, turning Europe from a single empire into a stage of rival nations. Internal disintegration was not yet the worst thing. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe once again trembled in convulsions as devastating attacks from outside flooded in like a flash flood. The border walls of the Carolingian Empire, already decayed, now completely collapsed before new invaders, those who knew neither mercy nor fear. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia, the Vikings appeared like ghosts on the sea. Riding on slender but extremely flexible dragon warships, they wove deep into rivers and along the coast to plunder monasteries and towns. Their shouts and the flash of steel from battle axes sowed endless terror. For the European people at that time, the Vikings were not just enemies, they were the wrath of God descending upon sinners. While the coast groaned under the Vikings, from the east the Magyars, also known as Hungarians, poured in like a dust storm. With bands of elite cavalry capable of shooting bows from horseback at high speeds, they attacked lightning-fast, devastating defenceless settlements and turning everything to ash before reinforcements could arrive. The east of Europe became a field of death under the hoofprints of the Magyars. In the south, the tragedy continued as Saracen Muslim pirates continuously landed on the Mediterranean coasts. They seized islands, blockaded trade routes, and even raided the outskirts of Rome. The entire European continent at this time was like a fortress under siege from all directions, the cold north, the violent east, and the fiery south. In that crisis, the people of Europe realized a harsh truth. Distant kings could not save them. They could only rely on themselves and the stone walls of local lords. Imagine a world where the king was only a distant name, a ghost of power reigning in old but helpless palaces in the face of reality. When the Carolingian kings were no longer strong enough to protect the people from Viking axes or Magyar hoofprints, power began to disintegrate and fall into the hands of those who could actually draw a sword on the spot, the local nobility. This was not just a change in personnel, but the moment when the medieval social order changed fundamentally. Power no longer flowed from top to bottom in a unified way. It huddled together, becoming fragmented and ruthlessly pragmatic. Europe during this period began to transform. From open plains, the continent was gradually covered by a dense network of castles. Initially, they were just high mounds of earth, with simple wooden towers surrounded by palisades, the Motte and Bailey model. But over time, rotting wood gave way to solid stone blocks. The grey cold stone walls were not just shelters against foreigners, but they became the eternal symbols of lordly power and the desire for survival in an age where safety was the ultimate luxury. From these majestic fortresses, lords began to establish a new order. They were not just generals, they were judges, police and tax collectors. Here, assets were concentrated, and distinct laws were issued without going through any royal dynasty. Power now carried a distinct local coercive nature. It was the kind of power that people could see with their own eyes, through the narrow windows of watchtowers, and feel clearly through the steel fists of patrolling soldiers. Few would expect that a small invention like the stirrup could shape an entire millennium. It allowed the warrior to stand firm on horseback to deliver earth-shattering thrusts, with long spears without falling. This military progress turned cavalry into the absolutely dominant force on the battlefield. Knights in shining chainmail, riding on carefully trained war horses, became the tanks of the Middle Ages. They did not just fight, they swept through and crushed every unorganized peasant infantry force. But that glamour had an extremely expensive price. To support a knight with full-body armor, a precious sword, and the best war horses, one needed the resources of an entire vast countryside. A knight could not go to the fields to plough, they had to spend their whole lives practicing the art of killing. The cost of maintaining this lifestyle was so large that only the elite class, those holding land, could shoulder it. From here, the nobility officially separated themselves from the crowd to become a professional warrior class, a distinct caste that considered honour and the sword as their reason for living. In a world where coins had disappeared from circulation, loyalty could only be bought with the most precious thing, land. This was the core of feudalism. A lord granted a piece of land, called a fief, to a vassal, in exchange for which the vassal had to swear a solemn oath to serve in the military and be absolutely loyal until death. But under the shadow of those majestic castles was the world of millions of serfs, souls who tied their lives to the land. Their day began when mist still lingered on the grass, awakened by church bells echoing across the fields like a reminder of their small human fate. It was a life of hands cracked by frost, of the pungent smell of damp earth blended with the smell of animal manure and the acrid smoke of wood fires from low thatched roofs. They did not own the land, they were a part of it, exchanging sweat and tears for fragile protection behind the Lord's stone walls. But the Middle Ages did not only have the grey colour of mud. Imagine you are standing in the middle of a market at a fief. It is a chaotic symphony of the rhythmic sound of metal hammers from the forge, the sound of bargaining in rough dialects, and the sound of wooden wheels creaking on the trail. The smell of rain-soaked wool blends with the smell of sizzling grilled meat and the pungent smell of artisanal brewed beer. There, among the small stalls, the breath of a raw and vital Europe was beating its first pulses of the commercial economy, signalling a great underlying transformation. At this time, kingdoms were no longer a unified bloc but became complex networks of personal relationships and binding oaths. A king could be the lord of one person, but that person was the lord of another, creating a pyramid of power full of treachery. Kings often fell into a weak position, their thrones eclipsed by powerful vassals, those who held strong military power and fortified castles, sometimes even wealthier and more prestigious than the king. This thorny feudal system dominated the West for many centuries, creating a stable but rigid order. It existed until true centralized states reappeared at the end of this period. However, as the clock of history touched the 10th century, a new dawn began to appear on the European horizon, bringing rays of hope for changing the face of the continent. A strange change occurred. The European climate warmed up significantly, a period known as the medieval warm period. Crops suddenly became lush, agricultural productivity soared, and Europe's hungry belly began to be filled. At the same time, hereditary invaders like the Vikings and Magyars also began to grow tired. They stopped their plundering footsteps, chose stable settlement, laid down their weapons to take up the cross, and gradually integrated into the Western Christian world. In the misty Anglo-Saxon land, King Alfred the Great performed a miracle amidst the Viking storm. Not just a warrior who repelled invaders, he was also a legislator, a lover of knowledge. Alfred and his successors unified the fragmented petty kingdoms, for the first time establishing a unified kingdom of England, laying the foundation for one of the most enduring powers in human history. On the other side of the Channel, in West Francia, a historical agreement took place. Vikings settling at the mouth of the Seine River swore loyalty to the Frankish king in exchange for land. They quickly learned French, accepted the Christian faith, but still kept the Viking warrior blood flowing in their veins. They became the Normans, elite and ambitious warriors, those who would soon shake the entire history of Europe from England to Sicily. Meanwhile, in the eastern land, Germany, a new star shone brightly, Otto I. In 955, on the field of Lechfeld, he led a coalition of Germanic tribes to completely defeat the Magyars, Hungarians, in a bloody battle. This victory completely ended the fear of invasions from the eastern steppes that had lasted for centuries. Otto I not only saved his country, he saved an entire civilization. The Magyars, after their bitter defeat, withdrew to settle stably and establish the Christian kingdom of Hungary. As for Otto I, with his illustrious feat, he entered Rome. There, in 962, he was crowned emperor by the Pope. Once again, the great title of Charlemagne found a worthy heir. Europe once again had a new empire, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Although it no longer looked exactly like old Rome, it brought a framework of order to Central Europe. After centuries of chaos and fear, this continent finally found the necessary stability. Europe was ready to shed the rough shell of the Dark Ages to enter the most brilliant and prosperous era of the Middle Ages. As the clock of history touched the number 1000, all of Europe seemed to hold its breath. Many had trembled waiting for the end of the world, but when the dawn of the new millennium appeared and the world had not yet collapsed, a source of intense life energy exploded. The year 1000 was not merely a soulless number on a calendar, It was a great turning point, a psychological line opening up 300 years of miraculous growth. This was when Europe shed its tattered coat of fear to don the brilliant attire of creation. The change began with the quietest things, the ploughshare. Listen to the metal screeching as the heavy iron ploughshare bit deep into the thick clay soil of the north, something that the weak wooden ploughs of the Roman era could never do. Combined with the three-field crop rotation system, the land was no longer exhausted but had time to revive. Food surplus, granaries full to the brim led to an unprecedented population explosion in history. A child born had more chances of survival, and the elderly had more warm winters by a well-supplied table. The sound of axes felling wood echoed across the continent. Dense jungles and gloomy swamps, once the realm of terrifying legends, were now pushed back to make way for new villages and rudimentary towns. Europeans no longer looked outside to invade. They were conducting an intense internal invasion, reclaiming their own continent with a frantic vitality. Desolate lands now became fields of golden wheat under the sun. Agricultural abundance awakened a sleeping monster: trade. The reviving economy led to the rise of trading networks that began to weave across the continent like new blood vessels. From small village markets, large international-scale fairs began to appear. The old roads of Rome once again bore the footprints of caravans, promoting a strong urbanization process, turning isolated fortresses into bustling commercial centres. Amidst that movement, a new class appeared in the once rigid social structure: the merchants, bourgeoisie. They were not blue-blooded nobility, nor were they hard-working peasants. They were rich thanks to their acumen, full of ambition, and carrying within them a desire for freedom. They began to use money to buy autonomy back from the hands of feudal lords, establishing proud, self-governing cities with their own privileges. A proverb of that time began to echo: Stadtluft macht frei. Town air makes you free. This transformation was most brilliantly expressed in the Italian peninsula. Maritime cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa restored dominance over the Mediterranean Sea, turning it into a home pond for fleets full of aromatics, silks, and eastern spices. As the pockets of merchants became full, their souls began to yearn for beauty. Art, architecture, and music began to bloom. Gothic cathedrals rose high as if wanting to touch heaven, signalling an era of luxury and intellect. But Europe was not only rich in money, they began to hunger for knowledge. The first universities were born in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, described as fortresses of knowledge, rising under the patronage of the church. These were no longer closed monasteries only for copying scriptures. These were places to preserve, debate, and develop human thought. Here, ancient Greek philosophy met Christian faith, creating fiery debates, laying the foundation for the scientific methodology and the spirit of seeking truth of the modern world. The European intelligentsia at this time were no longer satisfied with what was currently available. They began a new renaissance, a burning thirst to revive ancient knowledge from Greece and Rome. But remember, the light of knowledge did not only radiate from university lecture halls which were only for men. In the silence of monasteries, outstanding women like Hildegard von Bingen proved that intellect and soul have no gender limits. She was not only a theologian and musician, but also a natural scientist, who left behind massive works that astonished both popes and emperors with deep insights into the universe. At the same time, as money from trade poured in and construction techniques reached new heights, the face of Europe changed forever with the birth of Gothic architecture. Forget the thick, dark and cramped stone walls of the previous period. Now, elegant structures with pointed arches and flying buttresses rose straight up to the sky like a prayer reaching into eternity. Masterpieces like Notre Dame de Paris or Chartres were not just places of worship, but massive books in stone telling stories to the illiterate. Light through brilliant stained glass windows turned the interior space into an earthly paradise, a powerful affirmation for the wealth and burning faith of a Europe at the peak of its glory. The aristocracy from the heart of the old Carolingian Empire was no longer content with current boundaries. They carried out a process that historians call the Europeanization of Europe, a strong cultural and military expansion. They brought the feudal model, laws, and Western Christian faith to new lands, creating a continent more homogeneous than ever under the shadow of the cross and the sword. 1066, a year that every English student must remember. William, Duke of Normandy, a Norman with Viking blood and French intellect, carried out a daring invasion across the Channel. It was a gamble of destiny, where William wanted to seize the English throne that he believed belonged to him. On the slope of Senlac Hill in the historic Battle of Hastings, the Anglo-Saxon era forever closed when King Harold died in battle with an arrow through his eye. England from then on became a solid bastion of the Normans. They built castles everywhere, imposed an efficient management system, and turned French into the language of the upper class, forever changing the cultural flow of this island nation. On the sun-scorched Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista, Reconquest, entered its most decisive stage. Christian kingdoms in the north began to push the Muslims toward the south. This was not just a war for land, but a war for the soul of a peninsula, where every fortress captured was a step forward for Christian kingship. In Italy, Norman warriors once again proved their innate instinct for conquest when they seized Sicily from the hands of Muslims, establishing a prosperous and multicultural Norman kingdom. But amidst those power struggles with swords, a woman used her wisdom and massive wealth to turn the destiny of Europe, Eleanor of Aquitaine. As the Queen of both France and later England, she was not only the mother of legendary kings like Richard the Lionheart, but also a great patron for chivalric culture and courtly love, turning the lands she passed through into brilliant and romantic cultural centres. In Eastern Europe, waves of German migrants, the Drang nach Osten, turned the pristine lands of the Slavs into prosperous settlements. But the ambition of Europeans then went far beyond the continental boundaries. They began to dream of distant holy lands where gold and faith blended. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, the call of Pope Urban II shook the entire West. The shout Deus vult, God wills it, echoed everywhere. Tens of thousands of knights, peasants, and even sinners sewed crosses onto their clothes, setting out for Jerusalem with the belief that cleansing the Holy Land would be the shortest path to heaven. Crusader states sprouted along the Mediterranean coast. Although they were only fragile and unstable outposts in the heart of the Islamic world, it was from here that a magical door opened. Westerners for the first time came into contact with massive treasures of knowledge in medicine, astronomy and mathematics from the East, bringing back aromatics and silks that forever changed the tastes and life of Europe. Even though after 200 years these lands were eventually recaptured by Islamic forces under the command of brilliant leaders like Saladin, the Crusades sent a powerful message. The Catholic Church was no longer a purely religious organisation. It had become an absolute power, capable of mobilising tens of thousands of swords across thousands of miles. Few would have suspected that just a few centuries earlier, the Pope was very weak, merely a pawn in the hands of local Italian nobles. The Church then was a loose, corrupt network dominated by kingship. But a transformation from within had begun. A decisive reform movement originating from the Cluny Monastery was born. Their goal was nothing other than reclaiming independence, purity and majesty for the Church. They wanted to sweep away the sale of ecclesiastical offices and secular interference in the sanctuary. Reformers wanted to separate the Church from the world, rebuilding it into a powerful spiritual empire headed by the Pope as an absolute monarch of souls, no longer having to bow independence to any king or emperor. Conflict reached its climax when Pope Gregory VII faced off fiercely with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. This was not just a dispute over the right to appoint bishops, but a war to answer the question, who holds supreme power on this earth? The peak of this tragedy was an image that shocked the entire medieval world. Emperor Henry IV had to stand waiting for 3 days and nights in the bone-chilling cold, barefoot in the white snow outside the fortress of Canossa, to beg for forgiveness from the Pope. That was the most symbolic moment. Divine power had crushed royal power under its feet. However, history did not end simply like that. The war continued persistently. Henry IV later took revenge by bringing troops to invade Rome, appointing a new pope himself and forcing Gregory VII to die in exile. A painful lesson that the sword still has its own voice. But in the long run, the reform movement was the true winner. The Church transformed into a centralised power organisation, possessing a legal system, canon law, and an administrative apparatus that was the most sophisticated and complex of that time, far exceeding any rudimentary nation. With massive resources from tithes and vast lands, the Church was present in every corner of life from the moment a child was born, until an elderly person closed their eyes. The Pope at this time truly reigned at the top of the pyramid, ruling Europe as an absolute monarch of faith and morality. Seeing the power of popes become too large, beyond control, kings began to feel their thrones threatened. And so, instead of facing off directly once again, they began to learn from their own opponent. They began to build their own administrative apparatus, their own laws, and strengthen kingship to wait for an opportunity to regain the initiative. Part 6. The Rise of Kingdoms and the Gate of Death. Kings began to find ways to escape the grip of the armed nobility. Great stone castles sprouted everywhere, not just for defence but to assert prestige. Noble life became more luxurious and sophisticated with the ideal of the Christian knight and a code of chivalric conduct. But at the same time, they also gradually lost their freedom before the strengthening dynasties. The chivalric ideal not only promoted courage on the battlefield, but also the adoration of women. The image of the lady became the ultimate source of inspiration, taking medieval literature and poetry to a new height of romance and sophistication. In England, the Anglo-Norman dynasty and later the House of Plantagenet built a unified state apparatus and a legal system that was astonishingly effective. But it was precisely the tight management and heavy taxation of the kings that encountered unprecedented strong resistance from the nobility. In 1215, King John Lackland was forced to sign the Magna Carta. For the first time in history, the power of a monarch was limited by law. Its message was powerful. No one is above justice. This was the first seed of modern democracy, creating a distinct path for England compared to the rest of the continent. On the sun-scorched Iberian Peninsula, the hoofprints of Christian knights echoed more loudly than ever. Successive victories over the Muslims were not just seizures of land, but the affirmation of the supreme position of Christian kings. Each city recaptured, each fortress erected became solid bricks, laying the foundation for powerful centralized states. Here, dynastic power was cast in steel and guaranteed by iron faith, preparing for the birth of an empire that would master the oceans in the future. Contrasting with the explosion in the south, in France, the Capetian dynasty implemented a strategy of patience and cunning. From a small territory around Paris called the Île-de-France, the Capetian kings meticulously expanded their borders through marriage, diplomacy, and lightning-fast conquests. They turned a fragmented land into a tightly organized nation, where the king's will began to reach even the most distant border regions. France was gradually taking the shape of a central power on the continent. However, when looking to the east, at the Holy Roman Empire, a completely opposite reality was occurring. While England and France were consolidating, this once mighty empire was disintegrating. Conflicts between the emperor and the pope, along with the ambitions of local lords, tore the empire into hundreds of principalities, autonomous cities, and large and small fiefs. Unity was now only a distant illusion on the political map of Europe. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, with his legendary red beard and iron will, spent his whole life trying to sew back the pieces of old glory. He wanted to restore the absolute authority of Rome, but harsh reality dealt him humiliating failures. When Barbarossa fell, the dream of a unified empire also sank into the river of history. The noble title of emperor from then on was only an empty name on paper, a faint shadow compared to the formidable strength of vassal kings. The 13th century appeared as the most brilliant symphony of the Middle Ages, where prosperity reached its peak, Gothic cathedrals reached for the blue sky, and trade flourished across urban centres. But just as people felt most complacent, dark clouds began to pull in from the horizon. Around 1300, the European climate suddenly changed in an unusually harsh way. The brilliant medieval warm period ended, giving way to long winters and wet summers, signalling an era of woe. Torrential rains lasting year after year turned golden wheat fields into rotting mud puddles. Crops failed, reserves were exhausted, and horrific famine began to knock on every door, from serf huts to noble castles. Growth stopped, and society wavered in despair. But that was not yet all. A disaster unprecedented in human history was silently lurking, waiting for the moment to submerge the entire continent in darkness. In 1347, a commercial ship docked at a port in Sicily, carrying an uninvited passenger, the plague bacteria. The nightmare called the Black Death officially flooded into Europe. Like an uncontrollable forest fire, the pandemic swept across the continent with horrific destructive power. From bustling seaports to remote villages high in the mountains, nowhere escaped the scythe of death. The sound of funeral bells rang out continuously, drowning out even the prayers of priests. In just a few short years, 1/3 of Europe's population forever lay down in mass graves. This was the largest demographic pain in all of human history. Cities that were once bustling were now as silent as death. Fields with no one to cultivate became desolate, and towns once prosperous suddenly turned into ghost towns with no people. The social structure was torn apart, and belief in an ordered world seemed to have completely collapsed. Many towns were completely wiped off the map, but in the depths of that sorrow, history again showed the miracle of the germ of life. The lucky survivors after the great disaster began to wake up in a completely different world. The storm of disease had swept away the old order, but at the same time it cleared the ground for new seeds to sprout. A major shift in power and economy was silently taking place from the ruins themselves. In this new world, as the population plummeted, land suddenly became abundant while the demand for labour soared. The surviving peasants realised their own new value. They were no longer those who could be easily replaced. The bargaining power of workers now was stronger than ever, forcing the ruling class to look at them with a different eye. The breath of freedom began to spread. Peasants demanded liberation from the land and fairer wages. When the aristocracy, fearing the loss of privilege, tried to use law and violence to stifle them, bloody uprisings exploded like volcanoes across the continent. From Wat Tyler's rebellion in England to the Jacquerie in France, the cry for justice shook the roots of the feudal system. Despite being brutally suppressed by swords, the trend of history was irreversible. In Western Europe, serfdom, the chains that had imprisoned humans for centuries, began to collapse completely. It gave way to rudimentary personal freedoms and a more dynamic monetary economy. From the darkness of disease and blood, Europe was making the most important turning point to advance toward the modern era, where humans began to master their own destiny. From the ashes, human creativity exploded with inventions that changed the world, especially Gutenberg's printing press. It did not just print pages of the Bible, but also printed the end of the monopoly on knowledge. Lead letters liberated human thought from closed monastery walls. Without this revolution, there would be no Renaissance, no scientific revolution, and perhaps you would not be able to sit here with me to look back at history today. Cities recovered quickly and became the cradle of new cultural trends. A brilliant Renaissance began in Italy, aimed at surpassing even the achievements of Greece and Rome. Scholars at that time began to re-evaluate the position of humans in the universe, placing the individual above the constraints of divine power. They were the ones who performed a great historical marketing feat by calling the past millennium the Dark Ages, a way to downplay the past to honour their own brilliance. They saw themselves as those bringing light back, the direct bridge connecting ancient glory with the modern world. At the end of the 14th century, a strange and pungent scent began to cover European battlefields. The smell of sulphur from gunpowder. Rudimentary, crude but powerful gun barrels forever changed the face of war. Imagine the bravest knights, those who spent their whole lives practicing swordsmanship and donning shining silver armour, could now be easily struck down from afar by an ordinary infantryman holding a musket. The era of chivalrous duels died suffocated in gun smoke, giving way to the destructive power of technology and numbers. Gunpowder did not just destroy armour, it also knocked down the fortified castle walls of the nobility. Maintaining powerful and expensive artillery armies was a price that only kings, with a centralised tax system, had the ability to pay. Local lords could no longer hide behind stone walls to challenge the throne. From here, kings monopolised power, asserting absolute prestige before the feudal nobility. The silhouettes of modern sovereign states began to take clear shape on the political map. Amidst those changes, the 100 Years' War between England and France exploded, lasting long and brutally, exhausting both dynasties. But precisely in the furnace of suffering, a new weapon was forged: national will. People no longer fought only for a lord, but fought for France or England. The image of the peasant girl Joan of Arc, burning with religious faith and passionate patriotism, became an immortal symbol. She fanned the flames of revival, leading the French army to drive the English out of the territory, shaping the proud French national identity. On the Iberian Peninsula, a brilliant new chapter was written. The historic marriage between Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile was not just a royal ritual, it was the birth of a unified and powerful Spanish nation. In 1492, their coalition conquered Granada, the last stronghold of Muslims on the peninsula. The Reconquista, lasting nearly 8 centuries, ended in the sound of ringing church bells, making Spain a new power ready to challenge the world. At this time, the first modern nations like England, France and Spain had perfected the power apparatus, gathered resources, and were ready for a larger game on the international stage. In contrast to that concentration, the lands of Germany and Italy still looked like a carpet torn into 1,000 pieces by countless principalities and autonomous cities. They would have to wait many more centuries of pain and division before they could find the path to national unification. As the Middle Ages gradually closed, Europe not only revived after the pandemic but also became stronger, boiling with energy more than ever. City walls were no longer the boundaries of ambition. Europeans began to turn their vision toward the shores of distant oceans. They hungered for spices, the gold and silver of the East, and a desire to spread faith to lands no one yet knew. A restlessness named discovery spread across the ports. In 1492, as Christopher Columbus's 3 ships quietly set foot on the sands of the Americas, a bell signalling the end of the Middle Ages rang out across the world. The old had passed, and a new era, the early modern period, officially began. The world suddenly became infinitely vast, and the old order of knights and castles now became pages of history tinged with the colour of legends. A volatile millennium has passed, a great journey beginning from the desolate ruins of Rome to ships reaching out across the vast ocean. Europe has gone through darkness, through disease, through wars of faith to forge itself in hardship. Now, with knowledge from universities, power from gun barrels and ambition from kings, Europe was completely ready to step onto the main stage, beginning the journey to master and change the entire world. History is not dry words lying still on paper, but the breath, the pulse, and the root of the modern world in which we live. From the ruins of Rome to the brilliant light of the Renaissance, a millennium of the Middle Ages taught humanity lessons about resilience, faith, and infinite creativity, even in the darkest moments. Those knights, those serfs, those scholars, and those kings, they were the craftsmen who cast the shape of Europe in the world today. Our 1,000-year journey of medieval discovery closes here, but other heroic chapters of history are still waiting to be told. If you feel you love this journey back in time, please support us by clicking like and subscribing to the History Toons channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to be the first to step into the next vivid historical films. Which event or character in the Middle Ages impressed you the most? Please leave your opinion in the comments section below. We really want to discuss with you. Thank you for accompanying History Toons, goodbye, and see you in new chapters of history.